Okay, Laughing Man's position is that my fringe element's worldview comes straight out of my ass, and so it's probably wrong, like most things that come out of people's asses. He says this with premises that do more to muddle than clarify what he's saying. Now, normally you don't get to just proclaim that someone's whole worldview comes out of their ass. You have to actually show it, but apparently in this case, because he said it in the form of a syllogism, that makes it okay. He characterizes my view as though I believe it to be true that some dictator will come to power, try to implement my system, and then relinquish power. As though I believe this is going to happen. I don't think any of this is going to happen. I simply think it's the most likely way polycentric law would come about, as you need someone to A, manage the transition, and B, is willing to work against the will of the people who will almost certainly be opposed to it, because people hate new things. They hated Social Security. They hated the Bush tax cuts. People hate new things, and they like what exists. Right? People in East Germany are more favorable to big government than people in West Germany. People who lived under the Soviet Union are more favorable to the Soviet Union than people who didn't. Okay, people who live in the U.S. healthcare system favor it more than people who don't live in the right. People support that which exists. Right, and so because polycentric law does not exist, people will oppose it, and once it exists, they will support it. Okay, my position is that there ought to be a movement which capitalizes on white nationalists and libertarians, and this movement says move to Alaska and perhaps get a few rich businessmen on board to make it financially worthwhile for people of the right ideology to move to Alaska. Okay, the would-be dictator, or the to-be dictator, has a bodyguard, right? Similar to the SS or the NKVD or Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party security forces. And he then uses this security force to get the Congress to hand over power to the party. Or in the case of the Soviet Union, I view that as the best model with the Politburo, which is basically a bunch of kind of a round table of people who make decisions, and the Politburo who decides who replaces when the other person dies or retires. Okay, now it's unsure as to whether or not this would work. Okay, but this method of gaining power, this is not. It has precedent. Okay, so it's not complete speculation. This has been done before. And you could say, oh, well, the Nazi Party, the Soviet Union, and the Ba'ath Party weren't big fans of economic freedom. No, but this party would be. And we have an example of a dictator that was pro-economic freedom, Augusto Pinochet. Okay, we also have an oligarchy that was pro-economic freedom, the United Arab Emirates. And so a sort of a free market oligarchy is not totally speculative. And unlike Chile, the population of Alaska would generally be more receptive to free market policies and would not have any love for democracy, so I say. And you could say that there is a bit more speculation, but it's speculation based on the kind of propaganda campaign that would be used to get this movement off the ground. Okay. Now, yeah, so ideally it wouldn't be a dictator, but it would be an oligarchy. Now, I say this, and of course Laughing Man is going to butt in with his speculative problems, right? And yeah, not all coup attempts work. Got it, thanks. Then Laughing Man asks why the dictator, or in my modified case an oligarchy, would give up power to experiment with polycentric law. And you know what? He probably wouldn't. Or the Bureau of New Alaska, the Alaska Free State, probably would not give up power. But in my estimation, there is no other way to do that. Certainly, polycentric law is not going to come about democratically. Okay, it's not going to come about in a collapsed state environment. Definitely not. When you have collapsed states, that's not what happens. You get states returning pretty quick. And the organelles of a polycentric legal order aren't going to develop within the shell of the old world. The new world is not going to be built in the shell of the old. Moreover, in a polycentric legal order, there must be a transition. Now, ideally, what happens is you have two people who have a dispute, they find a third party, and the third party issues a ruling, and this ruling sets a precedent, and which becomes the de facto law, or common law, or case law. Okay? People who are regularly agreed upon by both parties in cases of dispute, these people become known as judges. And so over time, law is built up in this sort of organic fashion with all of the advantages of evolution, i.e. markets, and all of the disadvantages of markets in relation to central planning. Right? For example, markets are you need markets to function most of the time, but every once in a while you get some market narrowness. For example, QWERTY keyboards as opposed to Dvorak keyboards, or redundant cell phone networks. Certain market narrownesses that come about, but on the whole, markets are good. Okay, and so you have law coming about on a case by case basis. And maybe I should make a video where I talk more about market narrowness. I don't like the term market failure because that assumes a goal. I prefer market narrowness, and I think that's a topic in and of itself. Anyway, so that's ideally what would happen. However, if you were to transition an area from monocentric to polycentric law, you can't do that because you need law today and tomorrow. Okay, there's no time to build up this corpus of law through a buildup of case law, and so the transition must be immediate, and so it needs to be managed by a central authority, and this central authority has to be an agency that will see the plan through and has the ability to stand fast against the will of the people. Okay, so the only way polycentric law could be done is with some sort of autocracy, and it will not be done with democracy, and it probably won't even be done with an autocracy. But that's the only way it could be successful if attempted, and I believe it is more likely to be attempted in that environment than for it to be attempted democratically or agoristically. Why do I say that? Well, because any dictator or group of oligarchs who attempt to transition to a polycentric legal order, and the polycentric legal order succeeds, they will be remembered throughout the ages. That's all I can think of. I can think of a certain... why would a dictator want to do that? Well, so he could be remembered as the person who set it in motion. And in my estimation, he would try to set it in motion when he had, say, 20 years left to live. Okay, but even then, I don't think a dictator would do that. That's the only reasoning I could come up with, or you would try to persuade a dictator to do this. That's the only way I would persuade a dictator to do this, so that he could be remembered after he died much more than he would be remembered if he maintained the state. Okay. But even more than that, even if it doesn't lead to polycentric law, it would still lead to a better outcome than the United States. Because if we have a bunch of people with, the people I'm talking to are, European origin racialists and people who support economic freedom, and a broad overlap between the two groups. Even if it doesn't lead to polycentric law, it would still lead to better outcomes in the United States, meaning basically greater economic freedom, racial homogeneity, and a government that is committed to the demographic security of people of European origin. Okay. Moreover, this state could, this is speculating, could have polycentric law operate within its borders, and then overlay a tax for defense, immigration laws and investment. So what you have is a situation where, by default, polycentric law is allowed to function, but then you have an overlay of tax, immigration laws, and forced investment laws, to force people to invest at a higher rate than they normally would to stimulate economic development. All of these things would be much more difficult to do within a purely polycentric legal order. All right, without a state forcing people to do them. Now, I'm just floating all these things out there as possibilities, and what would normally happen is Spock talk, and now Laughing Man would pile on these things as if they were absolute proclamations about what I think definitely will happen. And it's just it's a great way to keep your mind shackled. It's asinine. Just a to-do checklist here. Okay, the first thing that needs to be done is that people with realistic views of the world, which is to say racialists and libertarians. Now, both groups overlap quite a bit, even though there is a profound philosophical disagreement between the hardcore libertarians and racialists. But there's a profound overlap just because they're reality-based, right? And it's a bunch of people looking at the world, right? Looking a little bit at IQ, but also looking at how groups of people behave around the world, looking at the effects of economic, and so it's reality-based to a greater degree than the average person is. Okay, there are lots of dumb libertarians and dumb white nationalists. Okay, but I'm just making this as a relative comparison. Okay, now these people, dare I say, we quote unquote, need a country first and foremost. All right, that's the first thing. You need a country. The United States is done. It's finished. It's over. Give up on the United States. The time to secede was yesterday. All right. And so the first order of business is getting out of the United States and getting a country populated by white racialists and libertarians. The best state for this, by a combination of population and geography, is Alaska. Alaska has a small population, and so it would be easier to flood by mass migration. It is geographically separate, it is not landlocked, and it has natural resources. Alaska is it. Now, I can be Laughing Man and say, well, what if secession doesn't happen? Or what if the U.S. invades as soon as Alaska tries to secede? All right? Those things could happen. Okay? They could also not happen. Okay? You know, what if when Estonia tried to break off from the USSR tried to invade? I mean, the USSR invaded when Czechoslovakia and Hungary tried to break off. All right, the USSR invaded then. So why didn't it invade when Estonia tried to break off in 1991? Because it didn't. Okay, U.S. could invade. That's true, and there would be no way to put up a fight against the U.S. military. Right? It could happen. But right now, Laughing Man and Spock Duck are, as far as I know, fans of the status quo. They can say they want this or that policy changed, but then they support democracy. Okay, we have democracy, and those policies aren't being implemented. So, you know, they might disagree with this, and they'll tell you why they disagree with this. Okay, but Barack Obama is Spock Talk's chosen president. Eric Holder is Laughing Man's chosen secretary of whatever he's the secretary of. Okay, these are their chosen men. Okay, and they have as far, I mean, by making this, it's not kind of a passive going along with it. By making this kind of spirited defense of the status quo, they are explicitly choosing Obama. All right, they have blooded themselves more than the dumbass, you know, voter who votes out of social obligation is. Okay, you support democracy, you support the results of democracy. I say why I think an oligarchy created within the conditions in which I prescribe will behave in the way that I predict. Okay, that's what I'm doing here. I don't get to just instantiate policy that this oligarchy will do. Okay, yet that is exactly what Spock Talk and Laughing Man do whenever they say, well, this is some policy that should be implemented in the U.S. that's not being implemented. What they're doing is they're instantiating policy within their chosen system that's not being implemented. Okay, when I do that, I'm called, oh, that's just radical politics speculation. Okay, but when they do it, it's not, or something. Okay, it's this double standard. Okay, now, this new state, the Alaska Free State, should it be a democracy or an oligarchy? Okay, should it be like North Korea? Or should it be like Zimbabwe? Okay, I think the North Korea plan is a better plan than the Zimbabwe plan. How much better? Hard to say. Or we could compare the United Arab Emirates to France. Okay, or United Arab Emirates to the United States. Okay, I think the United Arab Emirates is a better plan than the United States plan. Yeah, these people, Overmind, Laughing Man, Spock Talk, and a whole bunch of who cares. These people are just incorrigible. Okay, they get into these circle jerks. They identify targets, and then they spend hours going on why the target is always wrong, and it's just a bunch of dumb, cynical sarcasm. Okay, usually getting the target's position wrong in the process, and just beating down any curiosity or originality. Okay, they just find the facts necessary to refute the target, take a hyper-literal interpretation of the target's position, and whenever they think of a problem, they don't reason one extra inch to come up with the obvious solution. Okay, it's just, and that's a sign when you come up with problems but don't also try to self-solve or come up with the obvious solutions to the apparent problems. That's evidence of being agenda-driven and being intellectually dishonest.